10 families, one piece of land. That's all that stood between survival and losing everything. When you depend on something together, you stop calling it yours. You stop thinking about ownership. You start thinking about what happens if it fails. And in 1956, in the middle of Oklahoma, that question wasn't theoretical. It was the only thing that mattered. The Red Valley Cooperative wasn't born from idealism. It was born from desperation. 7 farming families in rural Oklahoma, 40 miles from anything that resembled a city, watched their individual operations crumble under a drought that stretched across 3 summers. The topsoil turned to powder. The cattle grew thin. The banks started sending letters that nobody wanted to open. James Turner was the first to say it out loud. He stood in the middle of what used to be his wheat field, looked at the cracked earth beneath his boots, and told his wife Margaret something that felt like surrender. "We can't make it alone." She didn't argue. She'd been counting the same numbers he had. Their savings were gone. Their equipment was failing. Their children were watching them with questions they didn't know how to answer. But Margaret didn't see surrender in James's words. She saw something else. A way forward that none of them had considered. What if they stopped competing? What if they pooled everything? Land, equipment, labor, risk. It sounded impossible. These were families who had spent generations building their own legacies, protecting their own property lines, making their own decisions. The idea of giving that up, of merging into something collective, went against everything they'd been taught about independence and self-reliance. But the drought didn't care about independence. It didn't care about legacy. And when Margaret Turner started talking to the other wives, when she started asking the question James was afraid to ask the other men, something shifted. Within 3 months, 7 families had signed an agreement. They called it the Red Valley Cooperative, 3,200 acres, shared ownership, shared profits, shared failure. The first year was chaos. Nobody knew how to make decisions as a group. Nobody knew how to divide labor fairly. There were arguments about everything: what to plant, when to plant it, who should operate which equipment, how to distribute the harvest. Some families wanted to pull out before the first season even ended, but then something unexpected happened. The cooperative survived its first harvest. Barely. The yields were modest, the profits were thin, but they made it through, and more importantly, they made it through together. By 1958, 2 more families had joined, then another. By 1960, the Red Valley Cooperative included 10 families and over 4,000 acres. It had become something none of them had planned: a lifeline. Samuel was born in 1961, the first child of the cooperative's 2nd generation. He grew up thinking the farm belonged to everyone. He didn't understand property lines. He didn't understand the concept of my family's land versus your family's land. To him, it was all just the farm, and everyone who worked it was family. That perspective would shape everything that came later. The 1960s brought stability. The cooperative invested in new equipment, expanded into cattle production, built a shared grain storage facility. The families who had nearly lost everything a decade earlier were now making more than they ever had as individual operators. The cooperative worked. Not perfectly, not without conflict, but it worked. The children of the founding families grew up together. They attended the same one-room schoolhouse. They worked the same fields. They sat at each other's dinner tables. The boundaries between families blurred in ways that would have seemed impossible in 1956. But the cooperative's success attracted attention. Not all of it welcome. By the early 1970s, neighboring farmers started asking questions. Some wanted to join. Others resented what they saw as an unfair advantage. A few accused the cooperative of driving down land values, of making it harder for independent farmers to compete. The tension grew. James Turner, now in his 50s, found himself defending something he'd once been terrified to create. The cooperative isn't about eliminating independence, he told a local newspaper in 1973. It's about redefining it. We're still individuals. We're still making our own choices. We're just doing it together. The 1980s farm crisis tested that philosophy. Agricultural prices collapsed, interest rates soared. Across rural Oklahoma, family farms shut down at a rate that felt apocalyptic. Entire communities disappeared. Auction signs appeared on properties that had been in families for generations. The Red Valley Cooperative survived, but just barely. The shared structure that had been its strength became its vulnerability. When commodity prices crashed, the cooperative's debt load was 10 times what any individual family would have carried. The banks that had once celebrated the cooperative's success now questioned whether it could sustain itself. 3 families left in 1985. They took their land shares and tried to make it independently. All 3 were foreclosed on within 18 months. The 7 remaining families made a decision that felt impossible. They took on more debt. They expanded their cattle operation. They converted portions of the farm to alternative crops. They refused to let the cooperative fail, even when every rational calculation said it should. Samuel, now in his mid-20s, took over operations management in 1986. He'd grown up in the cooperative structure, understood it in ways the founding generation never could. He saw inefficiencies they'd accepted as necessary. He saw opportunities they'd been too cautious to pursue. Under Samuel's leadership, the cooperative began transitioning to organic production in 1993. It was a massive risk. Organic certification took 3 years. During that transition period, they couldn't sell their crops as organic, but couldn't use conventional inputs to boost yields. It was a financial tightrope. But Samuel understood something the founding generation hadn't fully grasped. The cooperative's strength wasn't just shared resources, it was shared risk tolerance. No individual family could have afforded the organic transition. Together, they could absorb the temporary losses. By 1998, the Red Valley Cooperative was one of the largest certified organic operations in Oklahoma. The market for organic beef and grains was exploding. The cooperative's revenue tripled in 5 years. The families who had nearly lost everything in the 1980s were now more financially secure than they'd ever been. The success brought new challenges. The founding generation was aging. Several of the original members passed away in the early 2000s. Their children had to decide whether to stay or sell their inherited shares. Some stayed, some left. The cooperative absorbed the changes, adapted, continued. By 2010, the cooperative included families that had no connection to the original founders. New members bought shares as older families retired. The structure evolved from a tight-knit group that had survived crisis together into something more formal, more corporate, but still deeply communal. Samuel became the cooperative's president in 2012. He'd spent his entire life in this system. He believed in it with a conviction that sometimes troubled him, because he also saw what was happening in rural Oklahoma. The consolidation, the disappearance of small operations, the dominance of industrial agriculture. The cooperative was an anomaly, a success story in a landscape of failure. But it was also fragile in ways that weren't obvious from the outside. In 2018, a large agricultural corporation made an offer to buy the cooperative outright. The price was substantial, life-changing for every family involved. Several members wanted to take it. The debate lasted 6 months. Meetings that went past midnight. Arguments that threatened to tear apart relationships that had lasted decades. Samuel opposed the sale, not because he didn't understand the financial logic. He did, but he understood something else. The cooperative wasn't just an economic structure, it was a model, a demonstration that interdependence could work, that families could build something together that none of them could build alone. The vote was close, but the cooperative remained independent. The COVID-19 pandemic in 2020 tested the cooperative in unexpected ways. Supply chains collapsed, markets became unpredictable. But the cooperative's diversified structure, its local distribution networks, its ability to make decisions collectively, allowed it to adapt faster than larger operations. They shifted production, modified distribution, supported each other through illness and uncertainty. For a brief moment, the cooperatives model didn't seem like an anomaly. It seemed like the future, but the moment didn't last. By 2022, consolidation pressures returned, rising costs, labor shortages, the relentless pressure to scale up or shut down. Several families in the cooperative began questioning whether the model could survive another generation. In 2024, 3 of the 10 families announced they were leaving. They were retiring, their children had moved to cities, and they wanted to liquidate their shares. The cooperative absorbed the departure, but it strained the remaining structure. 7 families couldn't carry the same operational scale that 10 had managed. Samuel, now 63, found himself in the same position his father had been in 70 years earlier, asking whether the cooperative could survive, whether it should survive. But the question was different now. In 1956, the question was whether families could come together. In 2024, the question was whether they should stay together. The land hasn't changed. 3,200 acres of Oklahoma soil, the same dirt that James Turner stood on in 1956 when he admitted he couldn't make it alone. The crops still grow, the cattle still graze, the seasons still turn, but the context has changed. The cooperative is profitable, efficient, sustainable. It produces high-quality organic products for markets that value what it offers. By every conventional measure, it's successful. Except one, it's becoming harder to find families who want to join. Younger people don't want to tie their futures to land. They don't want to depend on something that requires constant collective decision-making. They want mobility, flexibility, options. The cooperative that was born from necessity is now struggling with abundance. The desperation that forced families together in 1956 doesn't exist in 2024. And without that pressure, the cooperative's model feels optional rather than essential. In early 2025, the remaining 7 families held a meeting, not to discuss operations or finances, to discuss purpose. What is the cooperative for, if not survival? What does it mean to stay together when you could just as easily make it alone? The answers weren't clear. Samuel argued that the cooperative represented something beyond economics, a way of living that valued interdependence over independence, community over isolation, long-term sustainability over short-term profit. Others argued that holding on to a model just because it worked in the past was sentimentality, not strategy. The meeting ended without resolution. The cooperative continues to operate. The fields are planted. The harvest is coming. The bills are paid. But the question remains. 10 families once depended on this land for survival. Now 7 families depend on it for something harder to define. Security, maybe. Identity, possibly. A connection to something larger than themselves, certainly. But dependence has a weight to it. And after 70 years, some are wondering if it's time to put it down. The Red Valley Cooperative still exists. It's still profitable. It's still producing. But it's also aging. The founding generation is gone. The second generation is retiring. The third generation is making choices that don't always include the farm. Samuel walks the property sometimes alone at sunrise. He sees the same land his father saw, the same soil, the same sky. But he sees it differently. His father saw survival. Samuel sees legacy, and he's not sure which matters more. There's no crisis forcing a decision, no drought, no collapse, just the slow, quiet pressure of time and change. The cooperative could continue for another 70 years, or it could end tomorrow. The land would remain either way. But what it represents, what it meant to those 10 families who depended on it, who built something together that none of them could build alone, that's already changing. Maybe it has to. Maybe that's what survival looks like over generations. Adaptation, evolution, letting go of what worked so something new can emerge. Or maybe it's loss. The slow erosion of a model that proved interdependence could work, replaced by a world that values independence above all else. Samuel doesn't have the answer. None of them do. They just have the land, the cooperative, and the question of what comes next. 10 families, one piece of land, one shared history, and a future that depends on what they choose to depend on. The farm is still there, the families are still there, but the lifeline, the thing that connected them, the necessity that made the cooperative more than just an economic arrangement, that's fading, and nobody knows what replaces it.